Thank you all for joining us this evening for an artist talk with Kelly Taylor Mitchell. My name is Hannah Katz. I'm the Grants and Education Manager here at Jivane, and I use she, her pronouns. Jivane is the leading cultural nonprofit organization dedicated to serving emerging and established artists through the collaborative creation of contemporary art using the process of hand papermaking. Based in Brooklyn, our programming includes residencies, fellowships, and workspace opportunities for artists, workshops and educational programming for all ages, and exhibitions and publications. You can see recordings of all of our past virtual artist talks on our website or our YouTube page. In this webinar, you can turn on automated captions by clicking the closed captions button on the bottom of your screen. We'll answer questions at the end. It's very helpful to receive questions throughout the talk in the Q&A box so that we can jump right into it when we get to the end of the presentation. Finally, I'm honored to introduce today's speaker. Kelly Taylor Mitchell is an artist and educator who lives and works in Atlanta, Georgia, where she is currently a 2023 to 2024 Midtown Alliance Artist in Residence and an assistant professor of art and visual culture at Spelman College. Kelly is the 2024 inaugural Nellie Mae Rose Prize Seed awardee, and other recent awards include the Atlanta Arcadia Award, the SMFA at Tufts Traveling Fellowship, the inaugural Spelman College Affiliate Fellow at the American Academy in Rome, and a Working Artist Project Fellowship at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Georgia. She's completed residencies with the University of Texas at Austin, Minnesota Center for Book Arts, Anderson Ranch Arts Center, Women's Studio Workshop, and Atlanta Contemporary. She has taught at Rhode Island School of Design, Virginia Commonwealth University, Penland School of Craft, and here at Jivane. Her work can be found in collections such as the National Museum for Women in the Arts, Harvard Fine Arts Library, Duke University Rare Book and Manuscript Library, Walker Arts Center Library, and publications including Burnaway, Art Paper, and Hand Papermaking. So please join me in welcoming Kelly Taylor Mitchell.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hannah, for facilitating and organizing this talk, Jivane for hosting us, and of course, all of you who are tuning in now or on the internet in the future. I'm just going to reiterate one thing that Hannah mentioned before I dive in. When I have the opportunity to speak about my work, I see it as an opportunity to learn about my work. So please, please, please do not hesitate to share thoughts, questions, feelings in the chat for us to talk about as we move through the talk or at the end. I also think it's helpful for you and for me to understand how I've organized the talk so you have a sense of where this conversation is going. The bulk of the talk is focusing on new bodies of work, 2023, 2024 handmade paper pieces, but I am very much an interdisciplinary artist. And it's impossible for me to talk, or almost impossible for me to talk about my paperwork and not mention sort of the context, the ecosystem that it exists inside of. And so I am an interdisciplinary artist that works across print, paper, installation, soft sculpture, artist books, and performance. And I named this talk Power Objects, Performance, and Paper to reflect the interdependent nature of all of these things in my practice, the way that they feed each other, rely on each other, support and influence each other. As I said, the emphasis of the talk will be on papermaking, but if you're looking for a broader picture of my practice, you can always find more on my website, kellytaylormitchellstudio.com. But I will start with that sort of ground laying, talking a little bit about the research that guides my practice, other materials that are present in the work that may not be immediately obvious in the paperwork, and then I'll get into that 2023 paperwork from Penland and the 2024 paperwork from my residency at UT Austin. So my practice looks to the ancestral homes of my grandparents as points of departure and points of return for my work. I love metaphors, so I'll start with one that has been really useful to help me understand how I think about this. These origin points act as seeds that I plant, and they often yield these very sort of unexpected harvests in the form of previously unknown to me stories, inventions, and diasporic connections within my family and beyond, which is also how I would define ancestral mapping in my work, because the themes of my work are really looking at ancestral mapping, ancestral memory, and legacies of craft. I also am really thinking about ancestors and teachers, ancestors as teachers. So here on your screen, you're seeing a picture of Mitchell Place, which is my paternal family farm in Gettysburg, North Carolina. And I'm seeing these ancestors as teachers, and I really see my grandfather, who is there in the Hawaiian shirt, as someone who taught me by example how to do this sort of ancestral mapping. My grandfather was my first memory worker. That's not language that I had access to growing up or while he was alive, but he really sat firmly in the role of family historian. When he passed away, I received an inheritance of memory, hundreds of film slides, hand sketched family trees, newspaper clippings, history about the Underground Railroad, where I grew up in suburban Philadelphia. And this inheritance has been like a boomerang in the practice. It takes me far away from these roots, and then it also sort of always brings me back. And it also interested me and introduced me to the ancestral legacy of marronage. So when I got all of this material from my grandfathers, when I learned about this family connection to marronage. If you're not familiar, marronage is the practice of formerly enslaved indigenous and outsider Europeans creating autonomous community, and in this case, looking at the Great Dismal Swamp, which is about 45 minutes to an hour from Mitchell Place that you're seeing on your screen now, and was a site of refuge for my ancestors. And learning about this history, learning about this place led me to want to know these ancestors to connect with them. But I only had the information that I had, this landscape, my artist practice, and myself. And so very much like a boomerang, I sort of traced this information I got from my grandfather, and sort of it mapped me and led me to Brazil. The reason it brought me to Brazil is because Brazil has a state called Bahia, which has the largest population of descendants from enslaved people. And as a result, Bahia sort of has emerged of this place where these histories of marronage are more baked into the national memory. And a lot of these marronage communities are still active in ways that they aren't in the United States, or at least in the Great Dismal Swamp. When I went, I was incredibly struck by the material synchronicities found in things like panna da costas. You're seeing women here who are part of one of the oldest maternal fraternities, which is responsible for the manumission of hundreds of enslaved people in this region of Brazil. And they often wear these panna da costa textiles as sacred ritual adornment. You'll also see this textile on the base of at-home or collective altars. But that textile was familiar to me. It reminded me of the tablecloth my grandma uses at Christmas or Easter or Thanksgiving or birthdays to mark her special occasion, and was often sort of this table setting for the place where so many of these oral histories and so much of this family myth and lore that grounds my practice was the primary site. That textile was the primary site where a lot of that information was shared. So that felt like a really beautiful an unexpected like homecoming or synchronicity while I was there in this initial trip. But again, I was really there to learn more about marronage. And I was also, through this sort of seeking, I was given a crash course into syncretism via candomblé, which is a religion in this region of Brazil in particular. When we think about syncretism, we're thinking about a dominant, often oppressive religious practice. In this case of candomblé, that would be Catholicism, that acts as this veil for non-dominant religions that are often non-Western, in this case, Yoruba-based or Western and Central African-based religious traditions, in order to make practicing that non-dominant religion possible. So what then starts to happen is you're getting this new mixed religious traditions. That's right, merging these two practices that take elements from both, which brought us candomblé, which is again a mix of this Catholicism and practices from Yoruba, Bantu, and Bay religious traditions. And because of these histories of enslavement, we see syncretic religious traditions throughout the diaspora, especially in Maroon communities. So I was really interested and continue to be really interested in how syncretism, which feels like this really complicated space because it offered so much protection, but it also resulted in a lot of erasure that happened over the merging through the generations. And so that's something that you're going to see me play with sort of indirectly in my work. You're going to see a lot of obscuring of images, protecting of images, of veils, and layering. I also became really interested in Bohemian sidewalks and masonry and its aesthetic parallels to quilting, which brought me back to ancestral ties, this time on my mom's side in Gee's Bend, Alabama. And unlike Mitchell Place, the family farm in North Carolina, I did not grow up with a lived relationship with family in Gee's Bend, where my mother's father grew up. But ancestral mapping brought me back. And in reconnecting, I started to really confront the ways we don't know all of these teachers, right? Again, thinking about how these teachers, in the case of my practice and in my life, are very much and often ancestors. And how so many practices that are passed down, how are they passed down indirectly? What can be left to discover? So these are things that started to emerge once I started reconnecting with this space as an adult. But before I move on into some of the work, it's important to name that I'm highlighting these origin points really in this, what seems like a solely hereditary context, but that is not the only space, I think, in which they have value and power and importance. I also connect my work to chosen ancestors, fellow artists and writers who have become what I call my artist family tree. One of my favorite assignments to do with my junior level students at Spelman is the artist family tree assignment, right? Where we think about the ways in which our work is inherently connected and in conversation with people who came before us, and we're asking these questions and having these conversations. And I'm also really excited because the newest work that I'm going to share with you comes from that residency at UT Austin. And it really was the first time my maternal family archive was the central focus of a body of work, whereas before, sort of that initial seed was always sort of rooted in North Carolina. So it feels really exciting that I'm able to sort of spread that emphasis. So I'm going to share a little about my textile works. Again, I described my work as centering ancestral memory, ancestral mapping, legacies of craft as a type of sacred knowledge. My work in textiles exists in this ecosystem as a spiritual technology. Again, thinking about the ways in which our work is in conversation with others. This is not a term I came to on my own. I was introduced to this term by an incredible artist and papermaker, Krista Franklin. And the way I define it, I'm looking to sort of the very generic description of technology as, you know, something that allows something else to happen, or a manner of accomplishing a task. And so in this case, it is helping me accomplish this task of ancestral connection. So a spiritual task or a spiritual technology. And I also think this concept of spiritual technology intersects really nicely with this concept of power objects that I'm introducing in this conversation. I've been really interested in my work. It's also important to clarify that I don't believe that there's a single definition for something as broad as power objects. I think it is a term that is solely defined by the person who is using that object. So in my practice, I'm thinking about power objects as something that me, the user, can imbue with power. And I'm interested in what activity sort of facilitates that imbuing or that possibility. So I'm going to come back to that, especially in the paperworks, but I just want to offer that sort of container for how power objects are operating here. The textiles, like the one you're seeing on your screen, which I call totems, are all adorned with images of private performance using a gel medium transfer process. So I mentioned earlier, you're going to see a lot of layering and obscuring and revealing of images in my work, and that really runs through across the mediums I work with, and again, speaks back to that interest that syncretism sort of brings to the forefront of playing with protection and erasure. Here's an example of an image that would adorn a textile. So again, if we look back, we have this imagery on the surface of this textile. The textile takes the form of my body. I lay on these textiles, cut the form, and then adorn them with images from private performances. These performances happen in places like the Great Dismal Swamp, and it was really exciting. I'm just got back from a trip last week in the Great Dismal Swamp, and when I went in 2020, which is the image that you're seeing here, there was so little spoken of the history of the swamp and its relationship to marronage. Of course, I did not cover the entirety of the swamp. It is an incredibly vast landscape. It spans North Carolina and Virginia, but still I was not seeing the naming, the acknowledgement of the Black Indigenous folks who came together to create autonomous community in this space. And it was so exciting to go back in 2024 and see how that's changed so much. It's also important to sort of situate the spiritual technology work in relationship with utility. So hand embroidered and beaded masks are another example of spiritual technology in my work. It's a tool that's helping me accomplish a spiritual task. And so my work is very utilitarian in this way. And I've often described sort of my slow realization that my practice is a type of ancestor worship or offering. And I think that really speaks to the intentional, functional aspect of the work. And it's been interesting to observe how papermaking has sort of revealed itself of this like arm of my practice that allows me to sort of like observe this from like a bird's eye view, but not necessarily engage with that same utility with paper objects. I should also say that I think the function and utility that I'm describing in the work is directly related to this interest of legacies of craft, where craft is defined as an object that carries function or use. And for me, so much of that spiritual utility within the work comes from the use of passed down craft-based work, specifically things like hand sewing, which is really present, again, even in works where textiles aren't obviously present, like say the paperworks that we're going to look at. Another textile totem for you to showcase living materials, which are a big part of my work, no matter the medium that's being utilized: peanuts, popcorns, black-eyed peas. And this is really referencing diasporic practices of food as offering. And of course, there are a myriad of spiritual traditions, diaspora and beyond, that use sanctified foods as offering, whether it be for ancestors or gods or spirits, etc. And I'm interested in this sort of vocabulary of living materials and utilizing them to reflect the ancestral mapping that happens in my practice. So you're going to see peanuts from North Carolina, you're going to see Spanish moss fibers from Alabama, so on and so forth. You're going to see brick dust, like you can see at the base of this textile piece on your screen, and thinking about that as a protective tool. I describe these works as having this utility, and people often ask, like, how do they function? What does the utility look like in a museum space like you're seeing here? So for me, I haven't found a way, or haven't really been called to find a way to activate these in those spaces. So instead, it makes sense to think about how to protect them. And so I create this brick dust, which is not real brick dust, but is my own sort of blend, really calling on practices of self-protection that you see, especially in hoodoo traditions in the American South, another, right, Afro-syncretic religious tradition or spiritual tradition, where brick dust is laid around sort of the edges of the house or across a threshold to protect that space from harm. And so taking a similar approach to the work as well. A little insight into process. So here you're seeing the gel medium transfer onto that base textile. This process is relevant for papermaking too, because I do these gel medium transfers in some of the paperworks that you're going to see. And again, the forms of these textiles are really straightforward. I lay down on that textile by myself or with a family member, trace the form, and hem that by hand. And really thinking about Howardina Pindell and a lot of her paintings where she's sort of cut herself out of her canvas and sewn herself back in. with that process. So I mentioned this idea of legacies of craft when thinking about hand sewing. My work is really interested in passed down knowledge as sacred knowledge. I also think a lot of what my practice is helping me do or is trying to do is to use my studio practice to find more of this knowledge that lives beneath the surface or within my body, or that's unconscious, or that exists within feeling, right? Something I can't point to who, when, or how that knowledge came to me, but trying to find it. The aesthetics of quilting are really important to my work, and I often pull from my Grandma Nan's quilts, different shapes or symbols as I'm writing this visual language of my work. You're seeing my Grandma Nan here in the middle, and my mom as well, and my sister with family quilts all around. And I want to go back a second to this concept of a power object. And so again, I'm thinking of power objects as self-defined, and my definition being something that I can imbue with power. Right? That could be a seashell, that could be a teddy bear, that could be an art object that I create in my studio. And I'm fascinated by and interested in what makes possible that imbuing with power. And so for me, that hand-sewn stitch has emerged as a power object. It's both evidence of the process and the act of making, and it holds everything together. And so you're going to see references to the hand-sewn stitch often in my work and in this upcoming paperwork. I talked a little bit about that artistic family tree. It's also important to reiterate, that all of this ancestral knowledge that I'm seeking and mapping and working to honor does not happen in a vacuum. And so it's very much in conversation with folks like Toni Morrison, who taught me about rememory and beloved, this idea of recalling the forgotten. And this helped me connect my practice to speculative ways of imagining and creating and even inventing this ancestral knowledge, which led me to Saidiya Hartman's concept of critical fabulation, of working with and against the archive, and in this case, a passed down archive. Baba Ifa Karate has this incredible handbook that's still helping me understand religious concepts that I will always be learning, right? I'm not an initiant or practitioner of these practices. I'm sort of gleaning what I can to help me create pathways for ancestral connection that work for me. And I also think something important in this book is that it really reiterates that these religious traditions have intersections, but they also have divergences, and they're not homogenous. And then Feeling from Bettina Judd is a really important text here when we're thinking too about this idea of power objects. And it's helped me observe, something in my artist practice, which perhaps I was looking to be affirmed, because I felt affirmed when I picked up her book and was reading about the ways in which so many artists, myself included, see the power in process, and process as the most valuable part of the work, right? So the object is great, but what I'm really yearning for, looking for, all happens in process. And so I pulled a quote from Bettina's book. She's quoting Renee Stout, who is an incredible handmade paper series, which you're seeing one of those on the screen. She says, Renee Stout describes her creative process as the very purpose of her art, saying, well, I can make a piece and think it's nice. I want to be on to the next piece because I get everything from the process. The piece that I create is sort of the evidence of the process, but is also for the viewer to enjoy whatever it is that I was doing in my studio. But I want to be on to the actual act of creating the work. The work which is left behind is the evidence that something has happened here. So I really see the importance of this in my practice generally, but especially with my papermaking work, where the function of the work recedes, right? That spiritual function sort of backs away. But that paperwork may not carry that same utility in the object, but I think it carries that utility in the process, which is incredibly exciting to me to sort of discovered and learned. So a few more paper pieces that again sort of create that nice context for the studio practice, and then those newer bodies of work. I really love working with foraged fibers. You're seeing the critter beater in my studio here working away. You're also seeing some mountain grass being hand beaten. I think there's something really special when we think about, again, sort of like imbuing something with power or possibility. You know, a lot of my work, textile work, is incredibly slow and laborious, right? Sewing these sequins or beads or embroidery again and again and again. And so I think that time spent creates an intimacy between the artist and the object, which creates that possibility. And I think there's something similar in the papermaking process when you can engage in the process from the beginning, from identifying to cutting to soaking to cooking to beating. Don't get me wrong, I definitely love my linters and use them a lot. But you know, the forage fibers have really emerged as incredibly important in my practice. And for a long time, they sort of were confined to my artist books projects, which I'm not showing artist books here, but it's exciting that this new work that came out of Penland and UT really showcases those forage fibers outside of the artist book context. But before I got to the paper that I'm playing with now, I was really taking a sort of parts of the whole papermaking process approach. And I was also having a really sort of self-referential, generative approach to how I was developing these forms and these objects, which I really love that process, even if it's evolved. But the self-referential process was really looking at these hand-embroidered and beaded masks and making these small paper units, right? These sort of 3 to 4 inch in diameter paper circles that reflected the form, the shape, the texture of these individual sequins, and then sew them onto a base textile to create this whole singular object. The scale of these pieces, their references to sacred garments still really excite me, but I wanted to see how I could approach paper making in a way that still spoke back to the function and spiritual utility that's elsewhere in the work without that like one-to-one translation of like, here's this other object in my practice, and I'm sort of gonna like translate it into this other form. And that shift in mode is a big part of what brought forage fibers out of those artist books exclusively and into this like rectilinear paper work where, you know, I'm continue to be and very much was when I first started doing this, really unconcerned with these object-based outcomes. But again, thinking back to Bettina Judd and Renee Stout, but really engaged in the process and all that can be felt and learned and observed in the making of the thing. So I was teaching a papermaking workshop at Penland called Paper Collage in the Archive. And I would spend the evening in the studio playing with paper in a new way. Because really before this time, I was not making rectilinear paper at all. So that felt really fun to go to something that is, you know, really foundational and sort of find so much possibility there. And I was also I see upon reflection, I was learning the ways that the elements elsewhere in the work, protection, obscured imagery, ancestral veneration, celebration, memory work, could speak through this form, even if it's sort of like a different font, right? So forage fibers are, again, incredibly important to this body of work and the work I'm going to show you that's more recent from 2024. And just like I'm using my grandparents' geographic homes as points of departure and return in my work and research, I'm treating forage fibers in the same way. They're all coming from these lineal origins, and they're also sort of becoming these points of departure and discovery behind the vat and in the paper itself that can really help me go to other places. In this case, you're seeing, I have to get a little close, you're seeing Alabama river cane. And something that I really also love with working with forage fibers, some of you who've worked with forage fibers may agree or disagree strongly, but I really love the surprise in the process, right? Like, you know, the basics, I need to cut it, I need to soak it, I need to cook it, but it's only till working with it that you know how long you need to cook it, how long you need to beat it. So it's a different type of relationship where maybe you have this trusted recipe or this familiarity. And so I really enjoy that sort of element of surprise and collaboration with the fiber. I'm also starting to work with flax here, which was really exciting. And I think in this body of work, maybe more so than I was acknowledging elsewhere, it's something I was thinking about, but I think there was like a really special positive confrontation at Penland about thinking about fibers as witnesses, right? As tools, fibers as tools of rememory or tools of recalling the forgotten when we're thinking about this idea of ancestral memory as this thing that you can both sort of like research and discover in sort of a more academic, archival room sort of way, but also something that you can invent, imagine, plant a seed, and grow something else from. And so I really was excited thinking about fibers as witnesses and tools of rememory, and thinking about fibers in the same way that I was talking about ancestors as teachers, right? These fibers often hold a lot of information, especially as healers. We think about something like Spanish moss, which I started working with in this body of work, which, you know, is a very traditional healing fiber that can be boiled for tea. One of my attractions to flax, which you're seeing often is like the base sheet. If you observe like the borders of these sheets have sort of like color poking out, that's the flax. And I was doing that for a few reasons. It was a really great substrate that I could get nice and thin to sort of help support some of these grass and leaf fibers, which were relatively weak and again, in certain cases, unfamiliar. So it made things a little more secure as I wanted to utilize inclusions and collage elements that had some weight to them. But I was also really interested in how flax captures and preserves process because of all the cockling and shrinking that flax is known to do. And so for me, it really ends up highlighting that thing that I'm so excited about, which is process, where I see like this idea of a power object in a more, I guess, conceptual way, right? Intersecting with this idea of process and the way that it shows the water and the hand as it has engaged with the work. And like the textile works, I also started to bring in image transfers from those private performances. So again, that's the gel medium transfer process and sort of pulling from my own archive that I'm building of this documentation of private performance, which you could call it private performance, you could call it ritual ceremony. But again, it's this site of ancestral connection. Similarly, the living materials that I introduced earlier and collections of adornment came into the work as well with black-eyed peas and adornments like sequin tassels. I'm definitely an artist that loves to collect. So I have lots of collections that sort of sit in my studio for quite some time, staring at me, knowing that their day will come and that we're both being patient. And so that really started to happen with the sequin tassels. And I think the sequin tassels serve a lot of functions that I've sort of assigned and understood upon reflection and observing the work later on. But like the way I was describing the brick dust with the textiles, they simultaneously call attention to something while keeping us, the viewer, at a distance. And so I'm really excited about those moments in the work where the sequin tassel is also sort of covering or protecting quote unquote nothing, right? Where there isn't an image transfer beneath that sequin tassel like the one you're seeing on your screen. Because for me, that really highlights the importance I see in these forage fibers as being these sort of carriers of information. So many really important learnings that I ended up taking with me into the next body of work. And one of them was utilizing blowouts. I love blowouts. You're seeing one here on the screen with that brown fiber, which is Georgia kudzu that I foraged from my yard here in Atlanta. I think utilizing the blowout further allowed me to bring in the visual language I'm using in my practice. And in this example, it's using the Canada Costa textile as my blowout stencil. So that same white textile we saw early on in the talk. And I see how the use of embossing, right? This came later, but I see how the use of embossing that you're seeing at the top left hand of the screen felt like this other like aha moment where I started to realize, all the ways that paper can be this really exciting channel to learn and think about the way memory looks and feels, etc. Just wanted to throw this in so that you could see another example of this Panna da Costa textile at play in my work. So again, the Panna da Costa textile is serving as the blowout stencil in some of these paper works. And so a lot of the materials in my practice are recycled in all different sorts of ways. And this is a really obvious one. And it also illustrates one of my collections. But I call this a forever work in progress piece. It's a space where I'm trying to sort of map, organize, understand, invent my grandfather's slide archive that was left to me. So you're seeing heat image transfers on these Canada Costa textiles. And then again, speaking back to this reoccurring imagery of the hand sewn stitch, all of these image transfers will eventually have that protective stitch covering all of them, in addition to more of everything, more palms, more sequins, more images, more textiles. Something else in terms of process that really sort of presented itself in a really exciting way during Penland was the use of the decal box. I really only made a few larger pieces, 22 by 30, like what you're seeing here, and quickly fell in love with a tool that I wasn't utilizing that often in my work, at least not to this scale. And I think something I really loved is they invited so much slowness because the way it slowed down the draining process, especially since I was using flax. And I talked earlier about how much I value slowness in my work, especially you see it in the textile work again as this conduit for facilitating this sort of sense of possibility or power with the work. I also think it really simply just invited me to release control and work more intuitively. And now we're going to talk a little bit about my recent body of work from my residency at the Guest Artist in Print program at UT Austin, which they very kindly allowed me to treat more of a Guest Artist in Paper program. We essentially turned their litho studio into a paper studio. And I knew going in, I knew I was coming with all of these learnings from those shorter studio sessions at Penland. And so I knew I wanted to play more with blowouts. I knew I wanted to push more the tension between flax and the Alabama Spanish moss, the Georgia kudzu that I would be working with and had brought with me. I knew I wanted to play more with the visual vocabulary of my practice, the living materials, the sequins, the textiles, the image transfers. And I knew I wanted to really intentionally embrace process-centric making, where process then for me becomes performance, process then becomes ritual, and then becomes power object. I also can't talk about this body of work without talking about Melvin Edwards and his paper collaboration with Dieudonné. Knowing that I wanted to explore blowouts further, I immediately thought of these works. No matter how often I share this body of work or see it in person, I'm always sort of stunned by the way, at least I, and I think others, can really feel the physical and emotional weight of that lock centered in the middle of that paper, despite the paper being razor thin and light as a feather. And so a big part of that is using the characteristics of the fiber and the relationships they create together to speak, to convey information. And so I was excited with, again, playing more with how these fibers relate to each other to create these different effects, whether they're weight, whether they're sculptural, etc. During this program at UT, it was only a week, but I was in the studio thoroughly. It was a fantastic experience. And I was working primarily 22 by 30 or 18 by 24. So that's all the sizes you're going to see here. Something else I really love about this experience, but also just working in studio spaces generally, is the cross-pollination that's possible in these spaces. The manager of the print shop, Erin, is an incredible artist and paper maker, and she saw a lot of alignment and sort of our material sensibilities, and offered to share her crinkled paper confetti, which is present in a lot of these pieces. You're seeing those sort of pink strands and those yellow strands. Coming into the work, you're also seeing more of that blowout with the Panna da Costa, more of playing with the really crispy embossings you can get from those sequin tassels on the flax, image transfers, and inclusions from that textile collection. This go round, this body of work, I really dove into a long-standing collection that I knew I would use when the time was right, and I'm super happy that the time has come, because it's one of my favorite collections in my studio, which is my family reunion t-shirt collection. So whenever I go to the thrift store, I try to find some family reunion t-shirts to take with me. And so I started using these t-shirts to create these pendants, which is what you're seeing as an inclusion here coming off of the bottom of the rectangle. I was making these pendants, doing heat transfers of primarily documents, but some photos from my maternal family archive. So something I had mentioned earlier is that I was really excited that this opportunity and this body of work allowed me to really center that maternal archive in a way that I hadn't thus far in my practice. The piece also clearly shows, I think clearly shows the reference to the hand-sewn stitch I mentioned earlier through that X mark. So in a lot of these works, you're going to see the X mark, you're going to see sort of this dotted line, and that's all pulp painted with flax, and really, again, thinking about inserting that mark, right? Even if it doesn't have the literalness or that function, it still has the symbolic presence. Texas palm fronds, foraged very timely from the help of students on campus, were used as the stencil for a lot of the blowouts that weren't the textile blowouts. And I love the way that the palm fronds start to read, especially if you don't know that that's what the stencil is from, start to read as a hand, or sort of a silhouette of a figure in their hair, or some sort of like explosion. So that's been, again, an exciting place to like learn the possibilities present in the work. And I know I said it already, but I think this piece really showcases it beautifully. Something I was called to flax with was the way that it can highlight process. And I think you're really seeing that here on the left-hand side of the piece, where this like wake, like cockling movement is happening, which I think really highlights how the water moves through the fiber. Everybody does their decal box differently. You're seeing a little insight into how I do it. I love the magician style decal box with the plastic sheeting, which is what we were doing for these pieces. Because everything was so slow draining, you maybe can see a corner on the bottom left of that GIF where I'm pulling that plastic out. You maybe can see that we have another decal box where one of those larger sheets is drying. So I would sort of do the pour, pull the sheet, drain, do another one, and hopefully by the time that one drained, I could sort of be working simultaneously. So we got a really nice rhythm going. You're also seeing me couch my first time working with the Spanish moss. I had a great colleague at Spelman who works in food studies, who started bringing me Spanish moss from Sapelo Island, which is how I first got into using Spanish moss. And then on my next trip to the family farm in Alabama, I grabbed some from the yard to keep working with it. The flax also really surprised me in certain pieces because it became incredibly sculptural. I think those of us familiar with papermaking or familiar with flax know that it's really ideal for that, but I wasn't sort of expecting so much spontaneous sculptural elements in the work. This piece, I think, illustrates it really clearly. On the right-hand side, you're seeing where that rectangle sort of gets cut. And that's where it's popping up from the wall, anywhere from like 8 to 10 inches. And so I don't want to misrepresent myself. I keep talking about how I value process, which is true, but I am still excited about these object-based outcomes. While I also feel deeply what Renee Stout said earlier and wanting to get on to the next, not because of this need to like produce, but because of the energy and meaning that can be felt in the process and the act of making. And this was a great opportunity, really, just to iterate and play. I so enjoyed this body of work, and I'm really excited to continue with my next project that I'll share as we move into our Q&A. But you're seeing the decal box here as it's draining, almost done. You're also seeing us place the blowout. So you're seeing one of those Pana da Costa blowouts loose on the Penland, and then we're placing it onto the base sheet. So all of these paperworks are made entirely in the wet, all at once. So everything's happening in the wet, and then we press and head to the dry box. This work also allowed me to get into my raffia collection for the first time, thinking about sort of using these sequin tassels that are present in the mask works and the other textile works to really sort of like break the rectangle. You're seeing here my grandparents in the pendant in the form of a heat transfer. And then another work that maybe isn't fully legible in this image, but is incredibly dimensional. And it's amazing how sort of flexible flax is, despite it sometimes feeling brittle. This piece especially, I'm really able to sort of like pop and push different parts of the paper to get different sculptural outcomes, which I'm excited to play with more. I mentioned earlier, I just finished a trip to the Great Dismal Swamp. Currently, I'm collaborating with a composer, Chelsea Lowe, who's fantastic, who's based in North Carolina, and we're collaborating to make a work that's responding to the Great Dismal Swamp. So during our site visit about 2 weeks ago, I collected milkweed stalks and bold cypress leaves for paper making. I'm going to use these fibers in collaboration with flax. So again, keep pushing what I learned here. But I'm super excited for any questions. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Kelly. That was such a like rich selection of imagery.
Oh, thank you.
So we have a little bit of time left, and I would love to encourage everyone to submit questions through the Q&A, and we can jump right into it. We're starting with a great question. What do you hope to pass down and or preserve with your practice as a future ancestor?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. Oh, I think one thing that immediately comes to mind is that sense of curiosity. When I think about my grandfather and what he passed down, it was so rich. It was so much content, information, but it was also, you know, quote unquote, unfinished. Like it required my curiosity, it requires my caretaking and tending. And so I definitely want to pass down that seed of curiosity. And I think as so many things become faster, which in certain ways can be really useful and beautiful and special, I also want to pass down valuing slowness and how there can be, yeah, so much learned in that space. And when I think about people like my nephew and my soon-to-be niece who's on the way, I definitely also want to pass down sewing. And think, of course, I think how much, yeah, my influence from my grandmother and my mother who taught me how to sew has had a profound, clearly, impact on me. And so I would love to continue that legacy of sharing that knowledge as well. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I guess I'm so struck by how the things you hope to pass down are like values and ways of living. Because I almost expected you to say something about uh, like in the way that your work examines how people have historically reclaim power and as power objects, they
Mm-hmm.
are supposed to like embody a kind of power. And then
Hmm.
so it's not surprising, it's very fascinating to me that it's curiosity, slow, like ways of living.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And a really nice way to like encapsulate um like that aspect of like the art is a product of the process and process above all, but like the product has a lot of value too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
we have another great question. They start by saying thank you so much. What is your relationship with pigment? Is it a part of your
Hmm.
foraging process?
That's a great question. So I'm gonna sort of answer it in two parts. When I think about pigment, I immediately think about my textile works, which are all dyed. Some of them are naturally dyed, um, and some of them are synthetically dyed. Um, so that is like a primary space where I'm thinking about, and of course I'm looking at these and can't remember which one it was. For these two examples that I have for you in terms of the pigmenting process and the dyeing process. But then in the paper works, I'm not creating my own pigments, and I'm primarily working with um, aardvark pigments for the paperworks. But something you may have noticed, I don't at all pigment the forage fibers. So I think maybe it's become this like subconscious way to distinguish um, those fibers, both for myself and to like a viewer when they're looking at these pieces. It's really easy to distinguish, I think, which is which. Maybe not necessarily that you know that it's forage, right? But I think you can tell that one has there's been some like transformation in a way that maybe hasn't happened in the same way to the other. Um, and of course, that may change, but I feel pretty committed again, thinking about the fiber as something that, like, without intervention, without image transfers, without sequins, without tassels, like, is inherently valuable and like full of really delicious and necessary information, witnessing, etc. I hope that kind of answers.
We have another, thank you. I think um, that, the foraging speaks for itself. Um, We have another great question also about the foraged fibers. You
Hmm.
mentioned a part of your work is collecting, gathering. Does this act
Hmm.
relate to the performance or ancestral aspect of your work?
Hmm. Um, Yes. I think my reticence in my yes is I don't think all ritual is always hyper intentional. And the way I collect is really intentional, but not maybe in the way as intentional as sort of the ways I set up private performances. So like that feels a little different, but I am one sort of like rule, the only really rule I have for myself in foraging um, is especially when I'm at places like the farm or the Great Dismal Swamp, or really anywhere. I don't think there's a place I haven't tried to utilize this rule, is foraging materials that look like they're ready to be foraged, if that makes sense. I won't act like I've never cut something down because I have, but I really try to collect fibers that have started to dry out or sort of bend over and are putting some extra weight on the plant, um, and collect really intentionally, which um, is a yeah intentional act that I think has a performative quality, even if it's not on the surface.
Sure. We have another question. Depending on time, it may be our last question, but I encourage you all to keep writing them. These have been phenomenal questions. Um, Continuing with this understanding of being a future ancestor, in your
Mm-hmm.
practice, how do you think about the conservation of your work? If so, how? How do
Ooh.
you hope for your work? How do you hope for your work to be conserved? Do you do any conservation work for your family's archive? So I think that's two questions about the
Mm-hmm.
conservation of your artwork and the family archive.
Yeah, thank you. I love this question in both parts of it. I'll start with the end part. Um, I do a lot of archiving for my family. I feel both intimidated and honored to sort of be in my grandfather's shoes in that way. Um, I'm on the tail end of a project that's scanning and organizing both all of his slides and all of the photos my mom had in the house. So this is hundreds and hundreds of photos and sort of creating these different categories. And then this becomes an archive that like I pull from in my work. But of course, most importantly is like shared back with the family as something that's available to them. Um, and when I do pull from this archive for my work, when it's a literal pulling, meaning like pulling and like inserting as opposed to like living with, thinking with, etc. That's when you're going to see things like that hand sewn stitch, right? Sort of like protecting these images or thinking about like the consent of the people of these images who maybe aren't here. So that's something that's incredibly important for me as well. Um, Conservation. So I don't think about these objects as needing to live forever. Not that that's the goal of conservation, but um, my priority is again like how I can learn from them and engage their power or sort of borrow some of it. And so to me, that's like inherently temporary. And I also, especially the pieces that have like that spiritual utility, that's not like a transferable utility, right? Because as I said, I'm not a practitioner or an yeah, a practitioner of a religious tradition that has the ability to make these on behalf of other people, right? They're very one-sided in that way. Um, and so, yeah, their life is meant to be like other craft objects, sort of like lived and cared for. Like I will mend these works as they need them, but I'm not overly concerned about things like sizing or sunlight. Like I expect them to show signs of life. Um, and that is something that I embrace, even though sometimes that can feel hard in certain ways.
I love that you use the word mend as opposed
Mm,
to like more of a conservatorial approach.
hmm
It really does convey um, that it's a living thing, and it's so great to see the sort of evolution of the synthesis of all these different media and like ways of
hmm
relating to the work, and like the kind of the maximalism of the early papermaking, and then like
hmm
the return to more of like a more subtle imagery, and
Yeah.
then again like more accumulation, more maximalism. Um,
Mm,
I think we have time for one more, and it's going to be selfish. I'm going to ask my own question.
perfect.
I obviously met you as an educator in our workshop series last summer, and so I immediately could tell that you're a phenomenal educator. And I'm wondering how working as an educator and that type of knowledge transfer informs your work.
Mm, thank you for the kind words and the question. I see my role as educator as part of my work and studio practice, and I think as you're suggesting, I think with your question, um, I see that as part of like the responsibility of the practice generally, right? So I'm talking about craft-based knowledge, the legacies of craft as sacred knowledge. And to me, one of the sort of stools on the leg of craft is teaching it and sharing it and passing it down. And so that's how we get back to it feeling like a responsibility, right? Like it's part of the work because this work exists because that knowledge exists, because that knowledge was shared with me or was shared with someone else that I was able to connect with. Or again, I'm trying to like find the indirect learnings through this work. Um, And so therefore it like only feels right and fair to pass it on and to share it. And then of course, I think the thing that so many educators say, because it is incredibly true, which I learned so much from my students, new ways of working, new ways of thinking about working, of studio practice, of process. And so that is just an unbelievable honor. And it's also been incredibly exciting to see how papermaking has arrived at Spelman College, and having been able to build curriculum and coursework that is teaching paper practice, and to have the support and the tools to again share that knowledge and pass it on is an honor.
Thank you. Well, we've hit 7:30, so I want to say a huge thank you to you, Kelly, for sharing your work with us. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us. We're so grateful to share a Monday evening with you, and we really appreciate you tuning in. Okay, I hope everyone has a great night, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.